Welcome to Books at Berklee. I'm Judy Pinnolis, Associate Director for Instruction and Engagement at the Berklee Library. Today we speak with Frances Sullivan, who will be talking about her recent book, Cuba's Cosmopolitan Enclaves, Imperialism and Internationalism in Eastern Sugar Towns. Frances P. Sullivan is a historian of Latin America and the Caribbean. She focuses on transnational solidarity movements in the 20th century, with a special emphasis on anti-imperialism and race-based mobilizations. Her work has appeared in the New West Indian Guide, the Canadian Journal of Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and in edited volumes in Global Garveyism and Transnational Communism Across the Americas. Professor Sullivan is an award-winning educator who has experience teaching courses on Latin America, Caribbean, and African diasporic history, as well as on global solidarity movements, commodities and world history, insurgency and revolution in the Americas, and the Cold War in Latin America. Welcome to Books at Berklee, Dr. Sullivan.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much for taking the time I saw your tabbies, carefully read this book. It's such a thoughtful read you gave, and I love the questions you're asking. So thank you.
Thanks. Because so few people, will start right away with this, because so few people know much, if anything, let's say, about Cuban history, at least in the United States in general. Let's go into some of the main areas that impact the story behind this book. What are the key historical realities that the book explores? And we'll just take it from there and start from there.
Okay, sounds great. So by way of, kind of broad sweeps background, Cuba had been a colony of Spain since the time of Columbus. And beginning in 1868, the Cubans started fighting for their independence from Spain. This took place over the course of 3 separate wars. And your listeners may have heard of the final war, which becomes kind of the poorly named Spanish-American War. It's poorly named because it was really about Cuba, and Cubans were main belligerents in it. But that's when the United States entered the Cuban War, the final Cuban War of Independence, which began in 1895. The United States entered in 1898. And ostensibly helped liberate the island from the tyrannical Spanish. But what really happened is that the American liberators made the island safe for U.S. imperial expansion. So for both U.S. and Latin American history and historians and fancy word historiography, we call this the era. 1898 marks the beginning of the era of U.S. imperialism in Latin America and the Caribbean. So that's broad sweeps background. My book takes place specifically in the 1920s and 30s, when Cuba was essentially a neo-colony of the United States, and when very powerful U.S. corporations dominated the Cuban sugar economy. So sugar is the main thing grown in Cuba. And they really, the U.S. corporations, some of which your listeners will have heard of, for instance, the United Fruit Company is later becomes Chiquita Banana. These massive corporations set up shop all across Cuba, but the area I study is the northern coast of the easternmost province called Oriente. They set up shop there and established vast territorial holdings where they controlled absolutely everything that was needed to grow, harvest, process, ship out sugar. So what I'm talking about are owning hundreds of thousands of acres of land, controlling cane fields, worker housing, hospitals, the sugar mill itself, because the cane has to be ground down before it can be shipped, the ports and the railroads, so forth, everything, right down to the kind of rural guard post, like the local police post. They would own the land that the post sat on. So these companies are really kind of imperialist companies trying to dominate a space and make it entirely their own. Historians call these spaces agricultural export enclaves. And the idea behind these enclaves is to really kind of remove sugar production from Cuban society, to protect the production flow, to ensure smooth production and export of sugar, but also to exploit workers as well as easily as possible. So sugar companies during this time hired Cubans, but they also hired a ton of Afro-Caribbean workers whom they considered a cheaper and more easily exploitable workforce. And that's the kind of setting of this book. What I go on to do is explore how those workers who were supposedly isolated, supposedly kind of stuck in these backwater towns, were actually quite cosmopolitan. That's why we get the title, Cuba's Cosmopolitan Enclaves, and were involved in some tremendously important internet movements for internationalist activism. So I can pause there and find out what your next question is before I keep rambling.
Well, I was just sort of wondering where you got started, in an interest in this area. I mean, it's an unusually, focused research project. And when did you start writing about it, and how did you get interested in it?
Oh, wow, that's that's a lot. So this is my doctoral dissertation turned into a book. So that's
Oh,
what
okay.
historians do is when we finish our dissertation and we get our PhDs, the first thing you're supposed to do is turn that into a book. My process has taken a little longer. I've had 3 kids and a lovely life, but it's finally out and I'm thrilled. So I got started because I was really interested in labor organizing amongst those immigrant workers that I just described. So I should just preface this by saying the sugar workers, the sugar companies hired Afro-Caribbean immigrant workers who they thought they could easily exploit, as I said. And they're coming from Haiti and they're coming from the British West Indies, and they're also hiring Cubans. And I was interested in labor organizing amongst these workers for imperialist companies, labor unions, that kind of thing, very strict kind of social labor history. But when I got into the archives, I discovered that, paper after paper, document after document had headings, letterhead from Brooklyn, letterhead from Cincinnati, letterhead from the British West Indies, Mexico. So the people were writing letters and members of associations that really spanned the globe. So, just to give a few examples, a Quaker group based in Ohio planning a meeting in Mexico, and they're corresponding with people in Cuba about it. Dominicans and Cubans together organizing a protest against the U.S. occupation of the Dominican Republic. Or to get, more deeper into the 30s, Cuban women collecting clothing and money for orphans from the Spanish Civil War. So there's all these ways that people were not the isolated workers we have thought they were. Other historians have done this, a little bit about Central America. So the kind of notion of a closed off, isolated enclave, that's been debunked. But I really was struck by how kind of international their forms of mobilization and their international and their activism was.
Yeah,
So
that was,
that kind of
it was
just
really
down that
fascinating to
path.
see that these are not just people in some small town that are cut off from society, but they maintained and were part of a larger world. As a librarian, I was really struck by that deep level of research. And also now you're explaining this sort of serendipity that you found once you got into the archive that changed sort of the focus of your book, but there's like, I don't know, 20 pages of bibliography and 40 pages, 2 pages of footnotes. I mean, it's a very in-depth study, not to mention the index. But what kinds of things I think would be interesting to students? What kinds of things go into a process of writing a book like this? I mean, sure, you're reading other books and you're going into an archive, but what brings this all, how you can bring this all together? You've got so much data and so much information, and we're putting this all together just I mean, it seemed very Herculean. And granted, it's coming from a dissertation, but on a smaller level, if you were writing an undergraduate thesis or undergraduate level work, what does it take to put together materials from an archive or things you're finding, these little piece of paper here and this little piece of paper there, and put that together into a storyline and understand what it implies?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost an unfair setup, right? Because I spent years and years on this, decades.
Oh,
So, but
okay.
what I would say and so, my process took me to Cuba, to Cuban provincial archives, not just Havana, to the United States, to Washington, D.C., to London, because some of those workers were British West Indian, so they were British colonial subjects, kind of a variety of archives, which took, like I said, years. But what, kind of advice that I would give an undergrad working on a thesis would be, well, and I also want to add that internationalism is a little trendy. People are interested in the ways people think
Mhm.
globally, right? But the trickiness with that is that means you have to go to many different places, right? You have to explore many different sites, and that's time consuming. And I think that's sort of the answer. But the kind of question about, like, replicating this at a smaller scale, how we historians teach our students to operate, is to really get into the sources, like go to the archives, hold the papers. Yes, a ton is digitized, but certainly not everything is digitized. And it means something so different to be in the archive, especially in a place like Cuba, where the people that work in the archive, the people that live around the archive, can tell you their stories, right? But to get into the archives and really try to understand the mind of the people you're studying, through what they've left behind, and use that as a tool for storytelling. Try to, I think there's something to be said. And again, this is harder and harder because it's expensive, it's time consuming, but there's really something to be said for being there. I mean, I can't tell you how much I learned contextually by just chatting with somebody. Like the guy who sold coffee outside one of the archives in Cuba happened to be the descendant of Jamaicans. And I just told him what I was working on. And he told me all these stories that, maybe didn't make it into the book, but gave me so much rich context for the kind of the larger lives. So I would advocate for even an undergrad thesis going into the archives, really feeling the papers, understanding it. You can't do it from your desk at home. And in terms of process, my process, like I said, I keep saying this, and I should probably stop, being so self-deprecating, but it took a long time, and my process changed multiple times over the course of these years. But there's great citation management software. I love Zotero. There's great note-taking software. There's great ways of organizing your thinking. But one piece of advice that I got, and I wish I took it earlier, is just keep a running journal, because you're going
Mm,
to forget what you thought. You're in an
yes.
archive, you see a cool document, you do what you need, and then you have this fleeting thought, while you walk to buy the coffee from that nice guy, oh, maybe this means X, and then you don't write it down and you lose it. So
Well, that's why
I love the idea of a research journal.
a research journal is great. That's why I tell students it's not writing everything at the end. I say it's research, read, write at the same time. You're researching, you're reading it, and you're writing then while you're reading the material and thinking about it and putting it away as an idea to bring out later.
I
Um,
think that's so important. I'm gonna interrupt because I think that's
yeah,
so important.
yeah.
And there's this idea students have of the process of writing a book or an article, that you write it, maybe you revise it once or twice, and you're done. But I really, if I could convey one thing to my students, it's that revision is like 50 to 75% of the work.
Yeah.
And so even if you write down something and it's a terrible sentence and it makes no sense, but you revise and you revise and you revise with colleagues and friends and peers. So, people have read chapters and given me feedback infinite times. I couldn't count it.
Yeah.
So I'm always telling my students, writing is half the battle, if not less. Yeah.
I always say that when you write, you have something down, whatever it is, even if it's the vague idea, because it's always easier to edit and add than to start from scratch.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
And writing a book
that's
never happens A to Z. Start right at the beginning, end at the end.
well, another really fascinating piece of this that I think will be very interesting to our students is uh, the story of Garveyism. And a lot of people may not know much about that, but could you tell us a little bit briefly about what is that and how did it impact in the areas in Cuba that you talked about looking at in the research here?
Sure. So for background for Garveyism, so Marcus Garvey founded a movement that we now call Garveyism. He's a Jamaican man. He was a Jamaican man born in Jamaica, but traveled widely, which is interesting because I'm making this point about cosmopolitanism, and went on to found an organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And I'm pausing over the title to explain something, which I'll do in a second. So he founded it in 1914 in Jamaica, but moved it quickly to Harlem, which was rapidly becoming the epicenter of sort of a Black cultural and political renaissance, globally. So the Universal Negro Improvement Association, is very interesting. It remains the largest Black organization the world has ever seen. Global organization, out, they called them chapters, but branches of the organization were all over the Caribbean and Latin America, Central America, reaching as far as Africa. and other places. The organization stood for a few things that are captured in that title. So it's universal. So it's kind of a pan-Black organization. It didn't matter what your skin shade was, or what your island of origin was, or what your class level was, or your education level was. You're supposed to find this unity in the organization. So that's really important. It was a Black uplift, improvement association. So the idea was to kind of improve the status of the African descended race, kind of globally through different entrepreneurial ventures. So maybe one chapter would have like a grocery store, but the big famous one is a shipping company called the Black Star Line, named after the White Star Line, the Great White Fleet. Sorry. And it was, this was really famous. This big shipping company that's designed to move Black people as passengers, but also maybe carry freight. It never really worked out, but the kind of intent was to have a Black-owned shipping company because people were so mobile during this time.
Yeah.
So anyway, Garveyism is a really famous movement if you know your African diasporic history. But what's less known is that the number one country for Garveyism was the United States, because it was headquartered in Harlem. The second most important country with the second most chapters in the world was Cuba.
Wow.
And all of these, many of whom, mostly, but not exclusively, British West Indians from Jamaica and Trinidad and all the different British Caribbean islands, really made that movement grow in Cuba because they were there working in the sugar industry. So the towns that I study, and the kind of center is this United Fruit Company town called Banes. At first I was looking at it like, cool, there's Garveyism in Banes. That's interesting. But the more I studied it, the more I dug into it, the more I realized there's not just Garveyism in Banes. Banes chapter is leading the Caribbean arm. The Banes chapter is the most important chapter in probably the entire Caribbean. Or up there top three, because in terms of numbers, in terms of its organizational might, it's the Banes chapter, and really lots of chapters across the northern coast of Cuba are sending delegates to UNIA international conventions. There was an organizer from Banes, who's this Jamaican guy, who's sent to go organize in North Carolina. So
Wow.
what I'm trying to say here is that Harlem headquarters was not like the epicenter of everything rotating out from Harlem. There were other regional headquarters, and those were key players in the movement. And so I study Banes's role in kind of developing this movement, spreading it across the Caribbean, and make it's one great example of how kind of US imperialism begot, ironically, a very vocal and active internationalism that it didn't necessarily want to generate. But the Garvey movement kind of proliferated hand in hand with the expansion of US imperialist sugar companies on Cuba, on the island of Cuba.
Well, you mentioned these US sugar companies and US owned and controlled down to all of the levels. That sort of model has been seen in, other areas where company towns are formed and so on. And nobody owns anything. They're all in debt to the company.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
but the sugarcane led to this discontent in Cuba. And I was wondering if you could just give a picture of the conditions that these people worked in. I think it's important to understand what at that time and place, what was going on with these kinds of companies and how they were using workers.
Yeah, that's great. Because sometimes I think my book tells too celebratory of a story, but I want to make sure, thank you for asking that, because it helps me ensure that readers know and listeners know these were highly exploited people. And so sugar towns, the company towns, which is a great way of putting it, because we have company towns, mining towns in Appalachia,
That's
New
right.
England mills, textile mills. So the people might be familiar with company towns. In Cuba, the sugar company towns were constructed by sugar companies to be efficient and productive, but exploitive. And so workers were segregated racially and nationally. Sometimes the lines were a little fuzzy, but basically workers were segregated around racial and national lines. There were different housing for different populations of workers. They would work 24-hour, the mill, when it was running during the harvest season, would have to go 24 hours. They worked extremely long shifts, through the night. They were subject to kind of company control in every way. So in one obvious way would be like if they wanted to go anywhere, they had to ride company trains, right? That's clear. That's kind of obvious. But the company violence, the sugar companies have a monopoly on violence there. They had their own private rural private guards, in addition to the Cuban rural guard, whose job was to protect private property in the countryside. And if people wanted to start a strike or, cause trouble, they were subject to eviction from the company housing, to violence from the private guard or the rural guard. I mean, so this is like a very difficult space for people to navigate in, highly exploited, difficult labor conditions. The one of the big complaints, there were boom times and people did fairly well, otherwise they wouldn't, keep coming. But during the non-boom times, people were paid in credit at the company store, right? And they sometimes the company stores, if the times were really bad, would just close. So you have these worthless tokens. So the exploitation was really acute. And it's very depressing. And you can read some great work by Jorge Giovannetti Torres, who wrote about Black British subjects in Cuba. But there's story after story of, for instance, if you're focusing on Black British West Indians, of a West Indian immigrant who tries to fight back, who's then kicked off the property, assaulted by the rural guard, and tries to sue and gets no help. I mean, it's story after story like this. This is a very exploited population, really difficult working conditions. Yet, as I emphasize in the book, they nevertheless managed to put together a very vibrant associational and civic society that was deeply integrated with the wider world.
Oh, the strikes were part of the story in this book, and how they organized, some failing, some succeeding, and how that happened. One of the striking factors you have in the book is this sort of impact on local population who were not part of the sugar towns, and then these local people who came to work there, who were also dealing with all of these sort of, for them, foreigners who were brought into there to do work and then leave and then be shipped in and out. And there was this constant flow of people. The population was
Yeah.
not static. The population was not like who lived in Cuba at any one given time, where it was very different depending on the season and the year.
Yeah.
But one of the things that struck me was when they had your telling of the story when they started organizing and were leaders who were influenced or were communists. And it struck me that some of these people, they're trying to go into these communities and tell these Black people that they're exploited. They kind of knew it. You know, I mean, it seemed kind of Eurocentric, like these poor Black people or whatever. They don't know what's, that what's bad for them. I guess that I think it just seems so ridiculous that no matter whether it was the Europeans who were exploiting them or the Americans who were exploiting them or these other people who thought they were trying to help them, everybody's like not paying attention to what these people are and who they really are. And I think that comes out in the book that they really had some, despite all of this, sort of a wealth and a rich life and an international focus, and understood their situation very well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could sort of address that Eurocentrism that played a role no matter what part of the political spectrum they were on, whether they were communists or capitalists or whatever, they were still had that sort of looking down on these folks. And I thought that was very telling.
Yeah, thank you. That's a fun question because it gets back to our earlier point. This is something I really figured out in revision. So it ended up in the book, but this was not in the dissertation. This was not in the first drafts of the manuscript. But what you're pointing to is something that I really came to understand through many rounds of revision. But so to summarize for the listeners who haven't read the book, what Judy is talking about is there's one of the questions that always comes up when you talk about workers in Cuba is communism, because Cuba eventually goes communist, right? So what was the prehistory of that? And so in 1933, I imagine people will not be familiar with this history. In 1933, there was another revolution in Cuba before the 1959 revolution. And it was during that revolution, which lasted a matter of months, sugar workers, Cuban, foreign, black, white, Chinese, so Afro-Caribbean immigrants, Chinese immigrants, Cubans, all sorts of people took over the sugar mills in many cases and held the property. They occupied it. And so this is a really dramatic event in Cuban history. It's fascinating. And so I couldn't write this book, of course, without addressing this. But and one of the key questions is, how did the Communist Party lead these strikes, and then these occupations? And to what extent were they actually in command of the situation? And the answer is really confusing. In some cases, they absolutely led the strikes. In other cases, the strikes exceeded what the Communist Party, which had been organized since 1925, had ever purported to demand. In many ways, the communists were pretty conservative. They didn't want to provoke a U.S. intervention. So they were saying, like, leave the imperialists alone. We can't deal with like the U.S. Army intervening, the Marines showing up. But so that what happens, what you're describing with your question is you have this sense of the communist approach to the sugar workers as essentially paternalistic. And
Yeah.
they get there and they want to, in many ways, educate them. And I have this line that I found. I think I'm gonna write an article about it, where they say they want to improve the internationalist education of the masses. And what you're saying, and I really appreciate it that you took away this from the book, because I don't think I said it as well as you did. What you're pointing to is the fact that the workers already knew about internationalism. They
Yeah,
were
they
they
did.
were literally loading, sacks of sugar bound for sugar candy factories here in Boston, and for places they will not get to consume and enjoy, for to be manufactured into items they will not get to enjoy, and unloading consumer goods they can't afford, right? So they know what this is all about. They don't need an internationalist education. Half of them, more than half of them, in certain sectors, 90% of them are not even from Cuba. So what are we talking about, the internationalist education, right? So there's a certain chauvinism that comes with that. But I try to narrate the story such that the Communist Party does come around. It does say, oh, wait, we were wrong about these
Yeah.
immigrants. They're actually pretty radical, and they're kind of ahead of the game. And then the Communist Party ends up in a few letters I found in the Comintern archives in Moscow. A few letters, I wasn't there, but I hired a researcher to take some photographs, and then a lot have been digitized. So some letters I found, you see the kind of upper echelon of the global communist establishment basically saying, the workers are ahead of you. You need to catch up. And so what I make this argument in the book, which is that the kind of radicalism that happens in 1933, where they take over the mills and the factories, and the fields. I mean, they literally take over and like start slaughtering cows for themselves. The radicalism that's unfolding there is ahead of the Communist Party, and the Communist Party of Cuba needs to catch up. And they kind of do. They do. They kind of, for a time, not a long time, they do. And what's the interesting outcome of that for those historians of the radical left that are listening? The interesting outcome of that is that the Communist Party of Cuba is the only one in the Americas. I don't to defend Afro-Caribbean immigrant workers, to really come to their defense during this time. It doesn't happen in Costa Rica. It doesn't happen in Panama. It does not happen universally. But in Cuba, I think because of the radicalism exhibited in 1933 in the sugar fields and factories, the Communist Party actually truly, for once, develops a very internationalist outlook. It doesn't last. The Popular Front shows up in 1935, and there's this kind of new anti-fascist emphasis for global communism, and they start working with moderates. But for a time, they're quite on the side of Afro-Caribbean immigrants, and it's unique to the Americas. No other Communist Party in the Americas really does that.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that 1935 and also, the anti-fascism, because you had a chapter in there that was sort of about Spain. And I said, well, why is she going over there and talking about, all of these folks and fighting the fascists in Spain and things like that? And then it kind of comes back to this whole, how did the local people understand themselves? And also a lot of the Cubans volunteered to go over and fight fascism in Spain in the 30s and fight. Of course, they lost. Franco took over for so many years, but they still had that whole group in there. I do remember we had the Abraham Lincoln Brigade posters at Brandeis for many years, and there was a lot of
Mm,
information about uh, so many people participating in the anti-fascist movements in Spain. Um, I also wanted to ask you a little bit about s- some of the stories of individuals. You include some of these individual stories, which I were wonderful. I really thought that it made it so um applicable to all of the broader movement, but also seeing kind of how did this affect an individual. I was wondering if you could talk about maybe one person, um, and tell us a little bit about that person, and what they did and how, all of these events were surrounding them and how it affected them.
sure. Yeah, so I I wish I could do justice for all the individual stories that must be tied up in this, but it is hard to find individuals and really trace them through. One person that stands out to me, and this goes back to the earlier point about Garveyism, it's actually a couple. Harold and Anita Collins were Jamaicans who lived in Bonnes, that United Fruit Company town, in the 1920s. And what I think is really interesting about them, Harold and Anita Collins, is that they defy all of our stereotypes, right? So they're Jamaicans, but they're not sugar workers. They're not cane cutters. They are, I think she works as a domestic servant, which is quite common for British West Indian women. And he's a pharmacist. And so they have the kind, they're people of some means and some education. And they live in Bonnes. His brother also lives there, and they go, at least for a few years, to the annual convention in Harlem at Madison Square Garden the first year, I think. They go to the UNIA conventions and they speak on the floor, and you can look at these Garvey records and see Harold Collins speaking. He's speaking about the importance of Black textbooks, Black authored textbooks in classrooms. And then they come back and they share the news of what's going on at the convention. So having the sources from both Harlem and Cuba means that you get this really cool, like Garvey said, there's so many scholars of Garveyism. And it's a really interesting topic. And we'll see what Garvey said, but how it was received is a little trickier. But so if we look at Harold and Anita Collins, we can see their speeches they made in Bonnes did deliver the message that Garvey wanted to deliver. And why I chose him for this question is he then goes on to go to Tufts University here in Boston. And I haven't, I'm working vaguely on an article about him. He goes on to Tufts to do his medical degree. So he becomes a medical doctor, and he and Anita move to Harlem, where they're kind of part of the high class Harlem Society, and they're always covered in the society pages of the Black press in New York. They're traveling to Jamaica. They continue in the movement. I think, yeah. So Harold's sister becomes a very important official in the UNIA, and so you have these people who are quite influential in the Harlem Renaissance community of the 1920s and 30s. And they have their political formation in a sugar town in Cuba. So I think
Yeah,
that's a great example of like the kind of
yeah,
cosmopolitanism that these towns are steeped in.
yeah. It's fascinating stories. So many fascinating stories. Um, the last thing I guess that I would try to talk about, and your book is so complex, but is the sort of the ultimate of activities that, later in decades that we had the Cuban Revolution of 1959. And I was wondering if you could speak to the factors that led to the northeast of Cuba being such an epicenter of that interwar internationalism activities. But I also was very intrigued by the fact that ultimately Cuba resorted to the same model of reliance on sugar as an export under Castro, and he didn't like diversify
Yeah,
the
yeah.
economy. They were reliant on the Soviet Union now instead of shipping to America or wherever under the American ownership. They just switched to selling to Russia. And they still remain completely dependent economically on that sugar sales and mills and all of that. And at the end of the day, I guess there were not as many mills, but yeah, I was wondering if you could address some of that. And with all of the revolution and focus on this economic aspect of the dominance of that industry, why did it not diversify later on?
Wow. Well,
Uh,
that's
there were so many other possibilities for Cuba to diversify under, in the 50s and 60s and later on after this was changed hands politically.
yeah, it's a really complicated Cold War story, right? And this isn't a Cold War book, but I will say two things. One thing is you're mentioning the Revolution of 59, and it took me a while, again, revision, to understand just how important the stories I tell in the book are to the Revolution of 59. To me, I thought they were sort of different for many years. And then I realized key figures in the political scene that culminated in 59 were Bonnes based, were based in the sugar towns of northern Oriente. So, a very famous example is the dictator that Castro overthrew was named Fulgencio Batista. Batista's from Bonnes. His father sold cane to the company. Castro is from the region, and Batista's from Bonnes. He worked for the company. Castro's father sold cane to the company. I mean, these guys are from this region.
Right.
So this is, the
They're
key
all
figure
tied
playing
in.
it. What was
They're
that?
all tied in to
Yeah,
this.
they're totally tied in. The region's really important. It gets overlooked because it's such a space of US imperialism, but it's actually this major hub of kind of Cuban politics, especially during the eras of mass mobilization. Another family that keeps coming up are the Diaz Balarts. They are, people may have heard of them, your listeners may have heard of them, because two of the brothers, the grandchildren basically, you were congressmen in the United States for representing Florida, right? The conservative congressman. And, they kind of, that family, that lineage was involved in kind of trying to suppress the revolution of 33 in Banez. The grandfather was kicked out of his office for a little while. So, these are the battles playing out in 33 are kind of the battles that then blow up into 59.
Yeah, that
I
seems
wanted to
very.
make that point. Yeah. And then your question about, why do they keep focusing on sugar is really a question for another book, and lots of books have been written, but it's a question about the Cold War. So when Castro launches his revolution, and I always tell my students this, over and over and over again, he does not start out as a communist. He does not start out as a, Moscow lackey. He's trying to sort of, the history doesn't really matter, but what he's trying to do is go back to this Constitution of 1940. But this is now the Cold War in Latin America, and the middle ground is shrinking rapidly, and Cuba is like kind of one of the last straws in shrinking that middle ground, right? So when it's this tit for tat, I have a fun slide I teach my undergrads, but it's this back and forth. Cuba saying we're going to nationalize the big properties of companies like United Fruit. The United States saying you can't nationalize that, give it back. Cuba saying, well, it's done. And then the Americans saying, okay, we won't buy your sugar. Back and forth until we get, maybe by late 1961, Bay of Pig or April 61, Bay of Pigs invasion, right? And then the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? You get Cuba kind of firmly in the hands of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And they tried to diversify, and then they realized what's going to work is sugar for oil. They're going to sell to the United States to the Soviet
Russians.
Union
Yeah.
sugar at a discount, and the Soviet Union is going to sell oil at a discount. And that's the arrangement that holds until the Soviet Union falls. And when the
Right.
Soviet Union falls, you have an absolute crisis as Cuba loses its main benefactor. And that's, euphemistically called the special period. And so, the kind of long trajectory of this, like the story I tell about internationalism in the 1920s and 30s, it's really interesting because the Castro government really is one, and Lillian Guerra, who was an editor of the book, and edits the series that the book is in, makes it, writes beautiful histories of this. But the Castro government was one initially of mass mobilizations. And I'm writing about mass mobilizations, but it ironically ends up shutting down those mass mobilizations and
Yeah.
rebuilding them in its own image, and kind of recasting this history of internationalism as one of kind of communism. And it's not, it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah.
So the spaces for international connectedness close, and Banes is now, when I showed up in the archives near those towns, they didn't know what to do with me. They really don't experience a lot of foreigners. So now they kind of ironically are isolated. So it's a very complex like trajectory from internationalism to isolation and closed off.
And it was very clear in your book that the internationalism was not communism. It was the Garveyism. It was the exchange of people and ideas all over the place. It was more than one thing. It was not particularly. It wasn't even the Communist Party wasn't even there till the 20s. So um,
Yeah.
that it was very clear in your book about that distinction. Well, I was wondering if we could wrap up and say if you had any comments for our students and others looking into this book, if there is something that we can apply to our own time, or we see any aspects of this that people can read and learn about this that would then help them understand things today.
Yeah. I mean, I really try to think about this, and I always land, depending on my mood or whether I'm teaching this, or not, I land at different places. But for me, one really big takeaway is that I'm writing about a very exploited population. Sugar workers and their families lived difficult lives under the thumb of powerful companies. Um, Crazy, terrible working conditions, under the constant threat of violence. And yet they nevertheless managed to keep kind of an eye on global events, to care about other parts of the world, to know what was happening with the commodity they produced and the commodities they worked with. Um, to me, it's a really impressive story of global awareness, because I think universities and different institutions really want to promote global awareness, but how much do we really know about the commodities we use and enjoy in our daily lives, or the workers that build them or make them or harvest them? And so I kind of want the lesson to be one of kind of a challenge to those of us who have, more information than is housed in a Cuban library in the 1920s, in our pockets, right? We have all this information in our pockets. But are we really thinking about the kind of global connections that our daily lives are creating? And so, yeah, I think so for me, it's like a call to understanding those interconnections, those connectedness, especially around the kind of history of production of commodities, but also I have a big sense of awe for these workers, right? They have accomplished so much with so little. And it's sort of a challenge to me, with what do I want to accomplish in terms of making the world a better place, right? And what, with many more resources, much more means, how can I set about doing that myself? And I think that students can take that lesson away. Readers maybe will or won't, but it does help to kind of look at a population whose very existence was called into being by an imperialist company, whose goals were to isolate, who resisted that, and actually made deep connections that had profound impact on the global Garvey movement. Cuba sent so many volunteers to fight Franco in Spain, right? Everybody was watching. The global left was watching during 1933. They were, whether you were in Veracruz or Venezuela or the United States, people were like, what is happening in Cuba? This is inspiring. Let's take note. As I mentioned before, the communist left moves to the left after this. And so I just think it challenges our understanding of where the center and periphery of global politics are, and what people on the periphery can do. So I hope that we can all think a little bit differently about how activism is organized and spread, and who is capable of what.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, this has been fascinating, and I appreciate you talking to me about this book and, the making of the book, the researching of the book, and the conclusions that you've been reaching as you've gone along and looked at the data and looked at the information and analyzed it. So appreciated that so much. And thank you for being with us at Books at Berkeley.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the interview and the time, and congratulations on your eminent retirement. I hope to celebrate with you tomorrow. So thank you. It's really an honor to be
That would be wonderful. All
part of
right.
it.
Bye bye.
Bye. Thank you.